The burned-out Porsche sat at the center of the auction floor like something that had been alive. Its body was scorched black from fascia to bumper, paint vaporized, interior reduced to bare metal and melted wire. The CEO of the house stepped forward and declared it worthless, not worth a second look, and the room of investors laughed and turned away. Then a man in a grease-stained work shirt walked quietly across the floor to the car, lowered himself to one knee beside the blackened hull, and clicked on a small flashlight. Nobody stopped laughing. Not yet. Not for long. Stay until the end. What he found beneath that scorched frame would change everything that room believed about value. Adrian Cole had been waking up at 5:30 every morning for 3 years, not because he was ambitious in the conventional sense, but because the day had a way of demanding things from him before the sun was fully up. The garage attached to the back of his rental house on the east side of Cleveland was where he spent most of those early hours, a cramped workspace filled with ratchet sets, hydraulic jacks, torque wrenches hung in order on a pegboard, and the quiet hiss of a space heater that never quite kept the cold out in winter. He was 27 years old, a single father, and by any reasonable measure the world had not been particularly generous with him, but he had learned long ago to stop keeping score. His daughter, Bonnie, was 6, and she had his eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and on most school nights she sat at a folding table just inside the garage door doing her homework while he worked, the two of them exchanging occasional words over the sound of a radio that only picked up 2 stations clearly. It was not the life he had pictured, but it was a life he had built deliberately from what was available to him, and he tended it with the same methodical care he applied to everything else. Adrian had not always been fixing rust buckets for cash in his driveway. For 4 years he had worked as a restoration technician at a specialty shop in Columbus, one of 3 operations in Ohio that handled pre-war and early post-war European chassis with the kind of precision that most modern mechanics had never been trained to apply. He had a gift for understanding metal, not just what it was made of, but what it had been through. He could look at a weld seam and estimate within a few years when it had been laid down. He could run a finger along a frame rail and feel a hidden repair beneath the paint. He had learned most of it from books and from a decade of practical work, and the rest of it was something harder to name, the way some people have an ear for music or a hand for drawing. His supervisor at the Columbus shop had once called him the best natural eye for chassis integrity he had ever encountered, and he had meant it the way compliments mean something when they come from people who rarely give them. The trouble had not been Adrian's doing. The shop had taken on a client who wanted a documented provenance history manufactured for a car that did not have one, a vintage Alfa Romeo assembled from donor parts and being presented to the market as an original matching numbers example. The owner had offered to pay well for the paperwork. 2 of the 3 technicians had looked the other way. Adrian had refused, had told the shop owner directly that he would not sign off on falsified documentation under any circumstances, and had been let go within 2 weeks under the cover of a budget restructuring. He had filed a complaint with the industry registry and been largely ignored. He had moved back to Cleveland with Bonnie, set up the garage, and started taking whatever work walked in through the door. He did not speak about what had happened very often. He did not need to. He understood it clearly enough, and understanding something clearly is, in its own way, a form of moving past it. What Adrian did speak about, mostly to Aaron Blake, a 60-year-old master mechanic who ran a shop on the opposite end of the neighborhood and who was one of the few people in Cleveland who genuinely understood what Adrian knew, was the technical side of vintage European construction. They talked about it the way some men talk about baseball, with specificity and a kind of affection that outsiders found hard to follow. Aaron had told Adrian more than once that he was wasted on oil changes and brake jobs, that his knowledge belonged in a museum or a serious collector's workshop. Adrian would nod and change the subject. He had Bonnie to feed and a space heater to keep running, and the theoretical world of rare automobiles felt like a luxury he could not yet afford to inhabit. Isabella Vaughn had built her company, Vault Classic Auction House, in 3 years from a boutique consignment operation to one of the Midwest's most visible platforms for collector vehicle sales. She was 26, educated at a university in Boston, and genuinely talented at the parts of business she had been trained for: branding, investor relations, platform design, strategic partnerships with dealer networks across the country. What she lacked, and what she did not fully know she lacked, was the kind of technical foundation that comes from having spent actual time underneath actual cars. She had hired experts for that, or she believed she had. The gap between believing you have covered a weakness and having actually covered it is one of the more reliable sources of catastrophe in the world of commerce, and it has a way of staying invisible right up until the moment it becomes undeniable. The Porsche had arrived at Vault's Cleveland facility on a Thursday, delivered on a flatbed from an estate in rural Pennsylvania, where it had apparently spent the better part of several decades in a collapsed barn. The fire damage was extensive. The body panels on the driver's side were buckled and fused at the seams. The interior was entirely gone. The engine compartment had taken the worst of the heat, and most of what remained under the hood was carbon deposits and calcified rubber. What could be identified of the exterior suggested a late 1950s coach-built design, but the manufacturer's identification plates were either destroyed or missing entirely, and without a traceable serial number the car had no documented identity. That, according to Sebastian Reed, was precisely the point. Sebastian was Vault's COO, a man of 41 who had come to the company from a private equity background and who understood the mechanics of a transaction with an expertise he had never bothered to develop for the mechanics of a car. He was polished and plausible and had a way of framing self-interest as institutional wisdom, which is a skill that tends to work well for extended periods before it stops working completely. He had brought the Pennsylvania Porsche into Vault's inventory himself through a quiet arrangement with the estate's executor, paying almost nothing for it. The plan, which he had not shared with Isabella in full, was to have the vehicle appraised at a nominal value, run it through the public auction as a project lot, and acquire it through a third party at the floor price before transferring it privately to a collector in Scottsdale who had already agreed to pay considerably more. Sebastian had run variations of this scheme twice before on cars that were genuinely unremarkable and whose low value had made the arrangement merely opportunistic. This time, he did not yet know what he had found. Isabella had reviewed photographs of the Porsche and made a quick assessment. The car was visually destroyed. There was no visible serial plate. The market for unidentified fire-damaged vehicles was thin, and the risk to Vault's reputation of presenting a lot that fell apart under buyer scrutiny was something she was acutely sensitive to. She had consulted with two of her in-house technical evaluators, both of whom confirmed that without documentation the car had no meaningful auction value, and she had accepted Sebastian's recommendation to list it as a low-reserve curiosity lot at the end of the day's program. She had no particular reason to look deeper. Everything she had been given told the same story, and the story was simple: the car was worth almost nothing. Adrian Cole had been hired for 3 days by a facilities contractor to assist with setup and breakdown at Vault's auction venue, moving equipment, arranging display lighting, managing the various physical tasks that a large event required. He was not hired as an appraiser or a technician. He was hired because he had a valid contractor license, a reliable truck, and had answered a subcontracting call that nobody better positioned had bothered to take. On his second morning on the floor, he had been moving a rolling cart of cable management equipment past the back corner of the lot staging area when he saw the Porsche for the first time. He had stopped. Not dramatically, he did not drop anything or say anything aloud. He simply stopped moving, the way a person does when something is slightly wrong with what they are seeing and they cannot immediately name what it is. He set the cart aside and walked slowly around the car. The burn pattern on the left rocker panel was inconsistent with an accidental fire. The frame geometry, what little he could assess through the damage, had proportions that did not match any production coupe of that approximate era he could immediately identify. And there was something about the way the rear chassis rail curved inward near the differential mounting point, a detail that most people would read as fire distortion but that Adrian recognized, from a technical paper he had absorbed years earlier, as a deliberate engineering feature specific to a small series of experimental test vehicles built in Stuttgart in the late 1950s. He stood there long enough that a junior staff member passed and gave him an odd look. Then he picked up the cart and continued working, and said nothing to anyone for the rest of the day. The following morning, Adrian had approached a man named Curtis, one of Vault's in-house mechanical evaluators, and tried carefully to raise what he had noticed. He had not made claims. He had only asked questions: whether anyone had looked at the rear differential mounting geometry, whether the burn pattern had been analyzed separately from the general damage assessment, whether there was any further documentation from the Pennsylvania estate that hadn't been entered into the lot file. Curtis had listened with the patient, faintly condescending expression of a man who does not feel threatened by a question but also does not feel obligated to take it seriously. He told Adrian that the vehicle had been evaluated by 2 qualified assessors and that the lot was already filed and final, and he thanked him for his concern in a tone that did not mean what it said. Isabella had been on the floor that morning conducting a pre-auction walkthrough, and she had overheard the last portion of the exchange. She had not intervened, but she had made note of it the way she made note of most things, filed it as a minor irregularity and moved on. When she passed the Porsche herself, she had stopped for a moment, looked at it with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 3 years learning to read collector vehicles through visual impression and market positioning rather than mechanical analysis, and arrived at the same conclusion she had reached the first time. She said as much, loudly enough to carry across the floor to where Adrian was standing near the tool table. The car had no recovery value. It was a loss the company was converting into a lot, and that was the end of the discussion. Sebastian had been nearby, and he had smiled at the remark and then glanced at Adrian with the pleasant expression of a man who enjoys certain kinds of cruelty without it registering to himself as cruelty. He remarked, in a conversational tone that was nevertheless meant to carry, that if the car were worth anything, the man asking questions about it would have bought it already. Several people within earshot laughed. Adrian did not respond. He looked once at the Porsche, then picked up the cable cart and went back to work. Bonnie had come with him to the venue that afternoon because her school had a half-day and there was no aftercare available, and Aaron Blake, who sometimes watched her, had a customer in his shop he could not leave. She sat in the corner of the staging area on an overturned equipment crate with a library book and a small bag of crackers, her dark hair pulled into 2 uneven braids that Adrian had done himself that morning. Not particularly well. She had watched the exchange with Curtis, and she had watched Isabella walk past with her clipboard, and she had watched her father pick up the cart and go back to work. And she had not said a word. But when Adrian came to check on her an hour later, she looked up at him with an expression too composed for a 6-year-old, and he felt it somewhere that did not have a precise location. That night, after he had dropped Bonnie at his neighbor's apartment and she was asleep, Adrian drove back to the vault facility. He had a key fob from his contractor assignment that had not yet been collected, and the overnight security protocol for the staging area relied on the assumption that no one who had been in the building during the day would think it worth returning to after hours. He let himself in through the side entrance, moved quietly past the freight elevator, and made his way to the back of the lot floor where the Porsche sat under a single fluorescent light. He had brought a small bag, a high-powered inspection flashlight, a dental mirror on a flexible shaft, a set of thin pick tools, a fine wire brush, and a folded reference sheet he had printed at the library that afternoon from a technical archive, a partial reproduction of a factory document detailing the chassis numbering system used by the Stuttgart Experimental Division between 1957 and 1961. He set the bag down, clicked on the flashlight, and started from the front of the car. He worked systematically, the way he always worked, without urgency and without wasted motion, running the light along every accessible frame surface, using the dental mirror to see into recesses he could not reach directly, wiping carbon deposits away with the wire brush where they obscured the metal underneath. The firewall was partially intact, but the identification plate that would normally have been mounted there was gone, sheared off, not burned off, which was its own kind of information. He moved to the door surround, found nothing. He moved to the passenger sill, nothing readable. Then he went to the rear. He crouched behind the car and positioned the flashlight at a low angle along the inside face of the left chassis rail, and he saw it, not the plate itself, but the seam. There was a section of metal approximately 4 inches long that had been welded over the original surface. The weld was old, certainly decades old, and it had been painted and repainted multiple times, but under the fire damage the finish had burned away and the seam was visible if you knew what to look for. Someone had covered something. Adrian sat back on his heels in the quiet garage and thought about what a covered plate meant in context. On a production car it was a red flag, the kind that pointed toward theft or a troubled registration history, but on a prototype it was something else entirely. Experimental vehicles were often numbered through internal factory systems rather than the public registry, and their documentation trails were inconsistent, held in private archives that had not always survived intact. There were documented cases of test vehicles being disposed of informally when programs were discontinued, sometimes with their original identification obscured by engineers to prevent the cars from being traced back to proprietary development work. The Stuttgart experimental division had been particularly secretive about a small run of test coupes built on a modified spaceframe chassis in the late 1950s, vehicles that had never entered public production and whose current locations, if they still existed, were almost entirely unknown. He looked at the weld seam again. He needed to see what was beneath it, and he needed to do it without destroying what was there, because if he was right, what was there was a document more valuable than the car around it. He came back the following morning before the facility opened and tried to work the seam with a thin pick tool, applying controlled lateral pressure to test whether the welded section could be separated from the original plate beneath without heat. It could not. The weld had good penetration and the surface layers had bonded too thoroughly over too many decades. He stopped. He did not force it. Forcing it would mean damaging either the covering or the plate underneath, and if the plate was what he suspected, damage was not an option he was willing to accept. He crouched there for a while with the pick tool in his hand, thinking about what he had and what he still needed, the way a craftsman thinks through a problem rather than around it. For a moment he almost walked away, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because the weight of all the reasons it might come to nothing was pressing on him with a particular kind of heaviness. He was a hired laborer at a site where he had already been told twice that his opinion was not welcome. He had no official standing, no institutional backing, and no way to compel anyone with authority to listen to him. If he pushed any harder and was wrong, he would not work in this city again. He sat on an overturned crate in the dim staging area and stared at the car for a long minute, and he thought about Aaron Blake telling him years earlier that the most dangerous thing in this trade was not ignorance, but the silence of people who knew better. He stood up, packed the tools back into the bag, and drove to the library. He had thought about going to Isabella again. He had tried the day before, through a junior staff member who had told him, with genuine but functionally useless sympathy, that the CEO was not available for questions from the facilities team. He had also tried to reach Curtis a second time and been told the evaluation file was closed. He had no standing on site, no credentials that would open a door to anyone with authority. He was a contract laborer with a flashlight and a reference sheet, and the auction was scheduled for the following afternoon. That evening, after he had put Bonnie to bed, she had asked him from beneath her blanket, in the small and precise voice she used when she was thinking carefully about something, whether he knew what the right thing was to do. He had said yes. She had asked why he hadn't done it yet. He had sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without answering, and then she had said, in a tone that was half asleep and wholly serious, that if everybody else was wrong, he shouldn't need their permission to say so. He had turned off her light and sat in the kitchen for an hour after, and by the time he went to sleep he had made up his mind. The next morning Adrian arrived at the facility at 6 o'clock with a heat gun, a small calibrated unit designed for precision bodywork, capable of raising a localized surface temperature without causing thermal shock to the surrounding metal. He understood the pressure differentials involved. If the welded section had been applied over a stamped plate using a filler method, there would be a slight gap in the bond line at the seam edge, and controlled heat applied at that edge would cause differential expansion that would allow a thin blade to be introduced without fracturing the substrate beneath. It was delicate work, the kind that could not be hurried and could not be faked, and Adrian had done versions of it hundreds of times on far less consequential surfaces. He applied heat to the seam edge in 3-second intervals, checking the gap with a feeler gauge between each application, waiting for the surface temperature to stabilize before continuing. On the 9th interval, the feeler gauge found purchase a gap of less than half a millimeter, but enough. He introduced a thin stainless blade along the seam, applying pressure slowly, and the welded section shifted. Not free, still partially bonded, but enough that he could position the inspection mirror and the flashlight at an angle that let him see what lay beneath. There were numbers there, stamped into original factory steel, partially obscured by the overlying surface but clearly legible through the gap. He photographed them with his phone, 6 digits and a prefix code, and wrote them on the back of his reference sheet. Then he carefully pressed the welded section back into position and let the metal cool. He sat in the empty staging area for a moment, cross-referencing the prefix code against the factory document. His hands were steady. The prefix matched the Stuttgart Experimental Division designation for the 1958 prototype series without ambiguity. The digits he had photographed corresponded, when cross-referenced against the partial registry compiled by the Stuttgart Historical Vehicle Archive, a document Adrian had downloaded 2 years earlier during research he had done for a client who ultimately went elsewhere, to a chassis identified only by a construction number, assigned to a single test vehicle built as part of a 4-unit experimental coupe program in the autumn of 1958. Of the 4 units in that program, one had been documented as destroyed in a factory test incident in 1960. One had been acquired by a private collector in Switzerland in the early 1970s and was currently housed in a museum in Zurich. One had vanished from the documented record entirely sometime in the mid-1960s. And one, the one whose number matched what Adrian had found, had last been recorded in the possession of a Pennsylvania engineering contractor who had purchased it from a surplus auction in the late 1960s and transported it to a property in Lancaster County where it had never again been publicly documented. A surviving example of that program, in any condition, was not a car. It was a historical object. Its value on the open collector market, even with catastrophic fire damage, began at several $1,000,000. In fully restored condition, it would represent one of the most significant Porsche discoveries in a generation. Adrian had gone to the vault offices that morning and asked the reception staff to let him speak with Isabella Vaughn. He was told she was in a pre-auction briefing. He left his name and number. No one called back. He asked to speak with Sebastian Reed. Mr. Reed was not available for vendor inquiries. Adrian stood in the lobby for 10 minutes, then walked back out to his truck. The auction was beginning in 4 hours. Sebastian moved quickly that morning, and he was not moving carefully. He had confirmed through his intermediary in Scottsdale that the transfer agreement was in place. He had structured the acquisition through a shell company registered in Nevada, and he had ensured that the lot listing for the Pennsylvania Porsche was positioned at the end of the day's program, after the main lots had cleared, when buyer attention and media coverage would be at their thinnest. He expected the lot to clear at under $10,000, which was approximately what the scrap value of the chassis could support, and he expected no meaningful competition. He had done this twice before and it had worked twice before, and the fact that it continued to work had begun to feel to him like a form of competence. What Sebastian had not anticipated was that his arrangement was visible from the outside to anyone who looked at the right details. One of Vault's minority investors, a retired attorney named Patrick Whitmore, who sat on the company's advisory board and who had the careful and slightly suspicious disposition of someone who had spent 30 years in commercial litigation, had noticed an irregularity in the lot file for the Pennsylvania car that morning. The acquisition price paid by Vault was listed at nominal value with no supporting appraisal attached. The provenance documentation was incomplete in ways that would have required a formal disclosure to buyers under Vault's own published standards. Whitmore had raised the issue in a brief message to Isabella's office, and Isabella had forwarded it to Sebastian for a response, and Sebastian had responded that the file was within normal parameters for a distressed lot and that the disclosure standards had been applied appropriately. Isabella had read Sebastian's response and accepted it, mostly, but there was something underneath the acceptance that was not settled, a small unresolved pressure that she could not immediately account for. She had also received, through the same reception staff that had logged it and not acted on it, the name of a facilities contractor who had asked to speak with her twice in 2 days. She did not know why she went back and looked at that log entry. But she looked at it, and she saw the name, and she thought about the man she had watched crouching beside the Porsche on the auction floor, and she thought about the question he had asked Curtis about the rear differential mounting geometry. She did not act on it. Not yet. The auction started in 3 hours. The floor filled at its usual pace, buyers drifting in through the main entrance and taking their positions, catalog in hand, the room carrying the particular combination of money and concentration that descends on these spaces whenever significant ownership is about to change hands. The early lots moved efficiently, a 1963 Ferrari that drew aggressive competition, a pair of pre-war American Tours that went quickly to a dealer from Nashville, a collection of racing memorabilia that sparked a brief and intense bidding contest before settling at a figure that satisfied the room. Sebastian circulated on the floor with the comfortable visibility of a man who knows how the afternoon ends. Adrian arrived at the venue at 2 in the afternoon and was not turned away because his contractor fob had not yet been collected. He walked to the staging area, pulled on the work shirt he had left in his bag, and went to the edge of the auction floor. He stood near the back, holding the bag, watching the lots cycle through. The Porsche lot was item 41, second to last on the day's program. It came up at 4:15. The auctioneer described it in brief and technically accurate terms: a fire-damaged coupe of uncertain manufacture, probable late 1950s or early 1960s construction, no matching serial documentation, sold as found, no reserve. The expected price range listed in the catalog was $5,000 to $15,000. Sebastian, positioned near the sidewall, sent a text message to his intermediary in Scottsdale. Adrian walked onto the auction floor. He did not announce himself or ask permission. He walked directly to the car, which had been moved to the presentation pad at the front of the room, set his bag down beside the rear chassis, and crouched in the exact position he had used the night before and the morning before. The room's attention shifted. The auctioneer paused mid-sentence. Sebastian turned from the wall. Adrian said, loudly and without particular drama, that he needed to stop the lot, that there was a covered serial plate on the vehicle that had not been disclosed to buyers, and that he could demonstrate it. The room went to the kind of silence that comes from collective surprise rather than collective agreement. Isabella, who was standing in the operator's gallery above the floor, looked down. Sebastian said from the side of the room that security should remove the individual, and then added, in a conversational volume that was meant to carry to the people nearest him, that this man was a day laborer who had been told multiple times that the lot had been evaluated and closed. Several investors near the front turned to look at Sebastian rather than at Adrian, which was a small thing, but noticeable. Adrian had the heat gun out. He applied it to the seam edge in 3-second intervals, with the same precision and the same patience he had used on each of the previous attempts, and the room watched in the kind of suspended silence that descends when no one is certain whether what they are witnessing is a scene or a revelation. The auctioneer said "Sir" once and then stopped, because the room's attention had moved entirely past him to the man working behind the car. On the 9th interval, Adrian introduced the blade. He separated the welded section, this time completely, the bond yielding cleanly with a sound like a thin sheet of foil being peeled from glass, and laid it to the side of the chassis rail. The original factory surface was exposed. The serial plate was there, complete. Every digit legible, stamped in clean steel that had been shielded from the fire for decades by the metal that had been placed over it. Adrian held his phone next to the plate and read the numbers aloud to the room. Then he held up the printed reference sheet and read the corresponding archive entry, the construction number, the program year, the Stuttgart division designation, the 4 known units, and the last documented location of the one whose number matched what was stamped in the steel in front of them. The room was entirely silent. Isabella had come down from the gallery. She was standing 4 feet from the car, looking at the plate. Patrick Whitmore was beside her with his own phone pulled up, reading the same archive document, his expression the focused and undemonstrative one of a man who has just seen the precise shape of a very large problem become clear. Bonnie was sitting on the overturned equipment crate in the corner, her library book closed on her lap, watching her father from across the room. The minutes after the plate was revealed moved in a way that the people present would later describe differently, depending on where they had been standing. Those near the front of the room had seen every detail of Adrian's work and had understood before he finished reading the numbers what they were watching unfold. Those in the back had only the audio and had filled in the visual from the reactions around them. What no one present disputed was the sequence. The plate was there, the numbers matched, and the car that had been catalogued as a $5,000 to $15,000 distressed curiosity was, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most historically significant automotive discoveries to surface in public in recent memory. Isabella stood at the car for a long time after the reading. She was not performing composure, she was actually composed, in the way that a shock large enough to move past panic produces something quieter and more serious. She looked at the serial plate. She looked at Adrian's printed reference sheet. She looked at Adrian, who was putting his tools back into the bag with the same economy of motion he had used to take them out. Sebastian had left the floor before the reading of the numbers was finished. He had walked toward the back exit at a pace fast enough to register and slow enough to be deniable, and he did not come back. Patrick Whitmore had already sent a message to 2 board members, and one of the partners from the legal firm that advised Vault had called and was on the way. The internal review of Sebastian's arrangement, the Nevada Shell Company, the Scottsdale transfer agreement, the systematic suppression of the appraisal process that had allowed it all to proceed, would take weeks to formally document, but the outline of it became clear within hours and the conclusion it pointed toward was not ambiguous. The investors who had been in the room cycled, with the selective memory that people tend to apply to their better instincts in retrospect, through a version of events in which they had suspected something unusual about the lot from the beginning. The auctioneer added a formal notation to the session record. The lot was pulled from sale pending a complete independent appraisal and a legal review of the acquisition process. Adrian picked up his bag, stood, and walked toward the back of the room where Bonnie was sitting. She slid off the crate and took his hand without being asked, and they stood together for a moment, and neither of them said anything, because nothing that needed to be said right then required words. The formal appraisal, conducted 2 weeks later by an independent panel that included a representative from the Stuttgart Historical Vehicle Archive, confirmed what Adrian had identified. The chassis was the 3rd surviving unit of the 1958 experimental program. Its condition, while severe, preserved enough of the original structure to make full restoration technically possible. The estimated value in restored condition was placed at between $4 and $6 million. Even in its current state, the historical significance of the vehicle gave it an assessed worth several orders of magnitude above the figure that had been listed in the Vault catalog. Sebastian Reed resigned before the board's internal review was finalized. The Scottsdale arrangement was unwound. The Pennsylvania state executor was notified and brought into the legal process. Isabella Vaughn sat with Adrian Cole in the Vault conference room 10 days after the auction, with no other staff present, and the conversation between them lasted nearly 2 hours. She began by apologizing, not for the auction outcome or for the company's exposure, but for having dismissed him, for having created and maintained a structure in which the most technically knowledgeable person in the room had been systematically prevented from being heard. She said it without the practiced fluency of someone managing a situation for appearances. She said it because it was true and she had spent 10 days knowing it was true. Adrian had listened. And then he had said, simply, that he understood how these things happened, and that understanding how they happened was the only way to prevent them from happening again. She had asked him, before the conversation ended, whether he would consider coming to work for Vault as Director of Technical Evaluation, a new position, structured with full authority over the appraisal process and independent of commercial operations. She had given him the salary and the terms. He had not answered immediately. He had looked out the window for a moment, at nothing in particular, and then he had looked back at her and said that he would consider it, but that there was one condition that was not subject to negotiation: no lot at Vault would ever be listed without a full documented evaluation, regardless of what the commercial timeline required or what any member of the operations team recommended. No exceptions. No distressed lot carve-outs. No pressure from acquisition that bypassed the appraisal file. Isabella had said yes. Adrian had said he would call her in a few days. He called in 3. The first night after he accepted the position, Adrian worked late in the garage, finishing a brake job on a customer's pickup that had been waiting. The radio was on. Bonnie was at the folding table inside the garage door, her homework spread out in front of her, her pencil moving steadily in the yellow light. The space heater hissed in the corner. The pegboard of tools threw its familiar shadow across the far wall, and the whole garage smelled of oil and metal, and the particular warmth that comes from a small space that has been occupied long enough to take on the character of the people in it. He had not told Bonnie about the job yet. He would tell her in the morning, over breakfast. She would probably ask several questions that he would not entirely know how to answer, and then she would return to whatever she had been thinking about before, because she processed things at her own pace and on her own schedule, and there was nothing he could do about that except admire it. He thought about what Aaron Blake would say when he heard. He thought about the shop in Columbus and the paperwork he had refused to sign, and about how those two events, the refusal and the work shirt and the flashlight on the auction floor, were not separate chapters but the same one, the long continuous one about what a person does when they know the true value of something and the room around them insists otherwise. He set down the socket wrench and looked at Bonnie for a moment. She glanced up, saw him looking, and went back to her homework without making anything of it. The garage light was steady and warm. It fell evenly across the workbench and the tools and the concrete floor and the small figure at the folding table, and the whole scene was plain and ordinary in the way that Adrian had come to understand, over years that had asked a great deal of him, as something worth more than it appeared. Not everything that mattered announced itself from the outside. Not every number stamped in hidden metal was legible to someone who had never taken the time to look. He picked up the socket wrench and went back to work.